He thought avoiding the plot would be simple. Stay quiet, stay forgettable, let the protagonist fall for someone else. But 3 weeks in, Julian Voss began noticing something impossible. Silver hair in doorways that shouldn't have opened, his exact coffee order waiting before he'd even wanted it, a quiet devotion trailing him like a shadow that refused to fade. Every excuse he invented collapsed under how precise it all was. Then, one ordinary afternoon, Julian found the proof, sitting in plain sight the entire time, and understood, all at once, that this story had never belonged to anyone else. What had the gentle, smiling protagonist actually been planning all along? And why was Julian the only one who never saw it coming? Today's story follows Julian Voss, a man with exactly one rule: stay out of the plot, and one very determined protagonist who never got that memo. If you've ever been too oblivious for your own good when it came to love, let us know in the comments. We promise you're in good company. The first thing Julian Voss noticed, after opening his eyes, was that the mattress beneath him was frankly offensive. Not offensive in a bad way, offensive in the way that made a grown man suspicious of his own good fortune. It was the kind of mattress that belonged to people who had never once had to choose between rent and groceries. The second thing he noticed was that he had absolutely no idea where he was. For several long minutes he lay still under a set of navy blankets that smelled faintly of cedar, staring up at a ceiling painted with looping silver constellations that seemed to shimmer even without direct light. Morning sun poured through floor-length windows framed in dark wood, gilding the room in warm gold. Everything around him looked expensive in a way that made his skin prickle. This was not his studio apartment. This was not even in the same tax bracket as his studio apartment. The room alone could have swallowed 3 of his old apartments whole. Polished oak furniture, lamps that glowed faintly on their own, with no visible cord, shelves sagging under leather-bound textbooks that looked like they cost more than a semester of his old community college tuition. Julian sat up slowly. His skull throbbed, not a normal headache, but something closer to the sensation of 1,000 strangers' memories being crammed into a space built for one. The pain lasted only a few seconds. Then it vanished, and the world rearranged itself behind his eyes. Memories that weren't his own came flooding in like a levee breaking, a world stitched together out of magic and old money. A prestigious university tucked into rolling hills, noble houses with centuries of rivalries, and underneath all of it, unmistakably, the bones of a novel, a very specific, very familiar novel he had once devoured over a single sleepless weekend. Hearts Beneath the Ivy, a slow-burn campus BL romance that had lived rent-free in his head for the better part of a year. "No," he said out loud, voice cracking with disuse. "Absolutely not." Reality, unfortunately, did not care about his opinion. The memories kept arriving, and with them came the single worst piece of information a person could receive on a random Tuesday morning. He was not the protagonist. He was not even one of the 2 devastatingly attractive male leads readers had spent 400 chapters swooning over. He was, in fact, one of the most humiliating characters in the entire book, Julian Voss, the jealous roommate, the comic relief, the human embodiment of second-hand embarrassment. In the original story, this Julian spent nearly every scene he appeared in scheming against the protagonist, out of some tangled cocktail of envy and unrequited longing for the male leads. He spread rumors, he misplaced assignments. He manufactured misunderstandings out of thin air whenever the plot needed a speed bump. And every single scheme collapsed on him like a poorly built card tower. Readers loathed him. The protagonist barely registered his existence. The male leads couldn't reliably remember his last name. By the final chapter, Julian Voss had become less a character and more a cautionary tale. The answer to "What happens if you peak in petty?" He pressed both palms against his face. What did I do in my past life to deserve this? After a solid minute of quiet suffering, he made himself breathe. Panicking wasn't going to fix anything. He was alive. He was young, apparently healthy, and, if the memories were accurate, extremely well-funded. That last detail snapped spine straight. He reached for the sleek glass tablet resting on the nightstand and pulled up the account linked to this body's identity. The number on the screen made him choke on air that wasn't even there. He checked it again, then a third time, then a fourth, just to be thorough. The number refused to change. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. Okay, maybe this wasn't a total disaster. Sure, he'd been dropped into a BL novel as the designated punching bag. Sure. The original version of this body had all the emotional intelligence of a golden retriever chasing its own tail. But he'd also inherited a small fortune, a face that, he checked the mirror on the dresser, was doing him several favors, and a seat at one of the most prestigious magical universities on the continent. People in his old life would have committed several minor crimes for this exact scenario. Besides, Julian had zero interest in romance, especially not someone else's romance. Why waste a perfectly good second chance at life fighting over pretty men when the world was apparently full of untapped business opportunities? Magical transportation, magical communication crystals, enchanted convenience devices nobody had thought to mass produce yet. His entrepreneurial instincts, dormant since the moment of his death, roared back to life with a vengeance. Within the hour, he'd found a notebook and started sketching out ideas. A campus delivery service, affordable enchanted study aids, a peer tutoring network, a second-hand textbook exchange. Every new idea made him more optimistic than the last. For the first time since waking up in a stranger's spectacularly comfortable bed, he felt something like excitement. Maybe this second life could actually be good. That was when the dormitory door opened. Julian glanced up without really looking, then froze mid-glance. A young man stepped inside, arms full of books, and the entire room seemed to go quiet. Not from magic, not from some dramatic narrative flourish, but simply because the person standing in the doorway had the kind of presence that rearranged a room around him without trying. Soft, near-silver hair fell around a face that looked almost too finely made to be real, catching the morning light like it had been designed for it. There was a fragility to his features, but underneath it sat something steadier, a quiet, settled confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Pale blue eyes swept the room and landed on Julian. A gentle smile followed. "Morning," the young man said. Julian recognized him instantly. Not from his face, from the memories now living rent-free in his skull. Theodore Ashworth, the protagonist, the novel's beloved, endlessly gentle bottom, around whom the entire plot orbited. The book had described him in language so worshipful it bordered on parody, delicate, luminous, a flower untouched by hardship, and Julian remembered rolling his eyes every single time. Seeing him in person, Julian reluctantly conceded the author hadn't been exaggerating quite as much as he'd assumed. Theo genuinely looked like the kind of person strangers wrote bad poetry about. Still, appearances meant nothing. Julian knew exactly how this story was supposed to go, and he had no intention of playing his assigned role in it. He offered a polite, forgettable smile. "Morning." Then he went straight back to his notebook. Silence stretched. Theo blinked, visibly thrown. Julian understood the confusion. The original Julian would have already fired off 2 backhanded comments by now. Instead, this version of Julian was doing rough math on delivery service startup costs. After a beat, Theo crossed to his side of the room and began quietly unpacking. Julian returned to his numbers, and for a few blissful minutes everything felt manageable. Then the building exploded. Not metaphorically. An actual, floor-shaking, window-rattling explosion tore through campus, followed by the shriek of students somewhere below, and then a second detonation close on its heels. Julian looked up to find Theo already on his feet. "What was that?" Julian asked. "No idea," Theo said, perfectly calm, "but it sounded expensive." Julian stared at him, then laughed despite himself. Not exactly the reaction he'd expected out of the supposedly delicate protagonist. Together they bolted outside, and the moment they hit the central courtyard they were met with total chaos. Smoke pouring skyward, students scattering in every direction, professors barking orders that nobody was following. Several magical engineering demonstrations had apparently gone off in sequence, leaving a scorched crater where a flower bed used to be. At the center of the destruction stood 2 men, the twin epicenters of every romantic disaster the novel had ever engineered, the future male leads, Damien Wolfe and Felix Hart. Even coated in soot, they managed to look unfairly good. Damien stood with his usual rigid posture, dark hair mussed by the blast, cold gray eyes cataloging the damage with the calm of a man reviewing a spreadsheet. Beside him, golden-haired Felix looked far more entertained than concerned, which tracked, given what Julian remembered of his personality. Naturally, they were mid-argument. "You destabilized the containment array," Damien said, voice flat. Felix scoffed. "Impossible. I barely touched it. You touched it, because you told me to. I told you to inspect it. You should have been more specific. You should have used common sense." Julian watched this exchange with a rising sense of disbelief. These were the legendary male leads the future power couple readers had spent chapters swooning over. Currently, they sounded like two toddlers fighting over a broken vase. Before he could finish judging him, he noticed the space beside him had gone empty. Theo was already gone, and by the time Julian located him, he'd sprinted directly into the disaster zone. What? Julian's eyes went wide. Theo moved through the wreckage with startling competence, pulling injured students clear of debris, directing traffic away from unstable ground. Lifting rubble like it weighed nothing at all. One massive slab of stone had pinned a student's leg. Theo crouched, set both hands beneath it, and heaved it aside like it was made of foam. That slab had to weigh several hundred kilograms easily. Julian just stared. The protagonist carried an unconscious student to the medical tent without so much as a strained breath. Then he went back for another, and another. He never hesitated. He never looked afraid. Worse, he looked practiced, like he'd done this exact thing more times than a normal college freshman reasonably should have. "That's not fragile," Julian muttered to no one. "That's terrifying." Nearby, the argument had stopped. Damien had stopped arguing. Felix had stopped arguing. Both of them were staring at Theo with an intensity that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Julian recognized the scene immediately. The famous first meeting. The spark that supposedly kicked off years of romantic chaos between the three of them. It was happening right on schedule, right in front of him. Watching from a safe distance, Julian felt exactly one emotion: relief. None of it involved him. The plot was moving forward exactly as intended, without requiring his participation whatsoever. All he had to do now was stay out of the story's way, build an empire, and enjoy a peaceful second life. A simple plan, a reasonable plan. A plan that would have worked perfectly if fate hadn't already quietly decided that Julian Voss and Theodore Ashworth were about to become far more tangled up in each other's lives than either of them could have possibly predicted. By the time the courtyard chaos was finally cleared and the last stretcher wheeled away, Julian had pieced together enough of the situation to feel genuinely uneasy. It wasn't just that Theo had lifted a slab of stone with his bare hands, it was the way he'd done it. No hesitation, no visible strain, no flicker of the polite bewilderment most students wore when the world suddenly demanded something dangerous of them. He'd moved like someone executing a plan he'd already rehearsed 100 times, in 100 other disasters. That evening, back in their room, Julian found himself watching Theo across the space between their two beds with new suspicion. Theo sat cross-legged on his mattress, calmly rebandaging a scraped knuckle he'd apparently gotten while hauling debris, humming something under his breath as though the day's events had been mildly inconvenient at worst. "You could have been hurt," Julian said, before he could stop himself. Theo glanced up, mildly surprised by the concern. "I wasn't. You didn't know that beforehand. I had a reasonable idea," Theo said, and went back to his bandage as though that settled the matter entirely. Julian let it go. He had a notebook full of business plans to finish, and, more importantly, an unshakable rule he intended to keep. Stay out of the plot, stay out of the protagonist's orbit, and let the story unfold exactly the way it was supposed to, with him safely on the sidelines where the original Julian Voss belonged. He fell asleep that night, almost convinced he'd actually manage it. He would look back on that particular optimism, in later years, as one of the more charmingly naive moments of his second life. There was admittedly a brief window the next morning where the plan still seemed possible. Julian met with the Academy's housing coordinator to formally confirm his enrollment, half expecting some bureaucratic disaster given how the previous day had gone. Instead, the meeting was almost aggressively normal: a stack of paperwork, a map of the campus, a polite reminder that tuition for Noble-sponsored students was due at the start of each term, regardless of how many buildings happened to explode in the meantime. "Try to avoid the West Wing until the engineering department finishes their inquiry," the coordinator said, not looking up from her ledger. "And congratulations on your roommate assignment. Ashworth is one of our top-performing students. Very well liked." Julian accepted the compliment on Theo's behalf with the mild, distracted nod of someone still doing math in his head about warehouse rental costs. It wasn't until he was halfway back across the quad, papers tucked under one arm, that the word liked fully registered, and even then, he had no idea yet just how much of an understatement it would turn out to be. Behind him, the coordinator's office door clicked shut, and the quiet, ordinary hum of campus life carried on around him. Students hurrying between lectures, the distant clatter of a delivery cart, birdsong drifting from the courtyard trees that had, remarkably, survived the previous day's disaster completely unscathed. Julian firmly believed that avoiding the plot of a romance novel was, in its own way, a skill. It required patience, discipline, careful, deliberate planning. Most of all, it required staying as far away from protagonists as humanly possible. Unfortunately, 3 weeks into his second life, Julian was beginning to suspect the universe had taken this personally. The problem wasn't Damien Wolfe. The problem wasn't Felix Hart. Even as their rivalry over Theo's attention grew increasingly unhinged by the week. No, the problem was Theo himself. For reasons Julian could not explain, the man kept turning up. Everywhere. At first, Julian chalked it up to coincidence. They were roommates, after all. It would be strange if their paths never crossed on a campus this size. That excuse held up for about a week. The second week strained it considerably. By the third week, Julian was starting to question the fundamental laws of probability. One morning he left before sunrise to meet with a professor about a business proposal. Theo was already waiting, not near the professor's office, but directly outside their dormitory, holding a coffee. "Morning," Theo said, and handed it over. Julian took it on pure reflex, brain not yet fully online. It wasn't until he was halfway across campus that the thought caught up with him. Wait, why was he standing outside our door with my exact coffee order? More pressingly, how did Theo even know his order? He gave up trying to solve that particular mystery. There were more important things to focus on. Like money. Money was reliable. Money didn't mysteriously materialize wherever he happened to walk. Except then he went to the library. Theo was there. The student cafe. Theo was there. The engineering wing. Theo was there. A business seminar attended almost exclusively by aspiring entrepreneurs. A topic with zero relevance to Theo's major. Theo was there too, sitting front row, taking notes like his GPA depended on it. That last one finally cracked Julian's composure. The seminar had been scheduled in a cramped lecture hall on the far side of campus, in a building Theo had no earthly reason to visit. His major had nothing to do with commerce, and as far as Julian knew, he'd never once expressed interest in starting a business of his own, and yet there he was. When their eyes met, Theo looked delighted. Julian looked like a man reconsidering several of his life choices. After the lecture, Julian cornered him. "Theo? Julian crossed his arms. "Do you secretly live inside my walls?" Theo blinked, then actually laughed. Not his usual polished, public laugh, but something looser and more genuine. The sound caught Julian off guard badly enough that he lost his train of thought entirely. "You ask the strangest questions," Theo said. "I'm serious." "No, you're not." "I absolutely am." Theo's smile widened. "Julian, we share a room, we go to the same university, we're in several of the same classes, and, believe it or not, we're friends." Julian frowned. Friends? Since when? He didn't remember agreeing to that. Theo caught the look on his face and laughed again, which, irritatingly, only made Julian more suspicious, mostly because Theo looked far too pleased with himself about it. The strange appearances weren't even the strangest part. The male leads had developed an obsession of their own, not with Julian, and, as far as anyone could tell, not really with romance in general. They were obsessed with understanding Theo. The entire campus had noticed. Everyone except Damien and Felix themselves. One afternoon, Julian walked into the student center and immediately regretted it. Damien and Felix sat at a nearby table mid-argument, with Theo wedged between them wearing the exhausted expression of a man reevaluating every decision that had led him to that exact seat. "He prefers tea," Damien said, with total conviction. Felix scoffed. "Wrong. I am not wrong. You are. I've watched him drink tea. I've watched him drink coffee. Tea coffee." Theo slowly lowered his face into his hands. Julian considered turning around and pretending he'd never walked in. Unfortunately, Theo spotted him first, and his whole expression brightened on the spot. "Julian," the response came fast. Too fast. The exhaustion vanished like it had never existed, replaced by a smile that looked, genuinely, unmistakably, like the kind people reserved for someone they actually cared about. Julian felt a small, unplaceable alarm bell go off somewhere in the back of his mind. Theo stood and crossed the room toward him. Behind him, Damien and Felix stopped arguing and turned to stare directly at Julian. The whole atmosphere in the room shifted. "Why are they looking at me like that?" Julian asked. Theo glanced back. "They're curious. About what?" A pause. Then, with total honesty, "Because I talk about you." Julian nearly choked on his own spit. "You what?" "Quite often." "What?" You do come up a lot, Theo said, tilting his head, apparently baffled by Julian's reaction, which did absolutely nothing to help. Mercifully, a professor chose that exact moment to walk in, cutting the conversation short. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. The next day, Julian caught Damien watching him during a lecture. The day after, Felix cornered him with detailed questions about one of his business ventures. Within a week, both male leads had somehow ended up sharing his lunch table on a regular basis. Julian had become collateral damage in whatever strange three-way friendship Theo had assembled around himself. It didn't stop there, either. Over the following weeks, Julian noticed the strangeness compounding in small, cumulative ways. Damien started showing up to Julian's business seminars uninvited, sitting silently in the back row with a notebook of his own, occasionally offering unsolicited, and infuriatingly excellent, feedback on Julian's financial projections. Felix, for his part, appointed himself Julian's unofficial marketing consultant, despite having no relevant experience whatsoever, and spent an entire afternoon designing promotional flyers for the delivery service that were, against all odds, genuinely effective. "Why are you helping me?" Julian finally asked, cornering Felix outside the student center one afternoon. Felix blinked at him like the question made no sense. "Because you're Theo's person? I'm not Theo's person. I'm his roommate." "Sure," Felix said in the exact tone of someone who did not believe that for a second. "Anyway, I think you should change the flyer color. Blue tests better with upperclassmen." Julian gave up arguing. He was beginning to realize generally the more efficient option where any of the three of them were concerned. But the real problem, the one Julian couldn't stop turning over in his head, was the growing suspicion that Theo simply didn't match the book. The original novel had painted him as delicate, breakable, a protagonist who needed constant protecting. Reality disagreed, violently. Julian got his proof during the annual combat evaluation, when the entire student body gathered in the academy's arena for practical assessments. Most students treated it with appropriate seriousness. Theo looked faintly bored, which should have been Julian's first warning. The second warning arrived when Theo's opponent turned out to be one of the top-ranked combat students on campus. The third warning was that Theo won. The fourth was that he won in under 30 seconds. The fifth was that his opponent ended up embedded in the arena wall. The whole arena went dead silent. Thousands of students stared. Theo blinked at the crater he'd apparently created, then walked over and politely helped his unconscious opponent out of it. "Was that too much?" he asked. Nobody answered. The silence held. Theo sighed. "Sorry." Somehow the apology made it worse. The tournament itself, held a few weeks later, only confirmed everything the arena incident had already suggested. The Academy's annual magical combat tournament drew spectators from across the city. Noble families scouting future matches, corporate recruiters scouting future hires, professional combat leagues scouting future champions. Winning could genuinely alter a student's entire trajectory. Julian had zero personal interest in getting punched for public entertainment, but Damien and Felix dragged him to the stands anyway, insisting his presence was good luck, a claim Julian suspected had less to do with luck, and more to do with wanting company, while they nervously watched Theo's bracket. The arena was packed to capacity, thousands of students filling the stands while shimmering barriers rippled around the combat field below. Julian spent the early matches half-reading business proposals, only looking up when the crowd noise spiked. Theo had entered the field. Of course he had. The protagonist participated in everything. His opponent in the first round looked visibly relieved at the draw. Theo, after all, still looked exactly like the description in the book, gentle, refined, elegant enough to make painters weep with gratitude. That relief should have been the man's first warning. From what Julian remembered of the original novel, most characters treated Theo as intelligent and kind, rather than physically dangerous. Reality, evidently, had other plans. The first match ended in 27 seconds. The crowd sat in stunned silence, while Theo stood at the center of a small crater, looking faintly embarrassed by the whole situation. "Am I disqualified?" he asked the referee, who nearly dropped his clipboard in response. The crowd exploded into applause anyway. Julian put his face in his hands. By the fourth match, rumors had spread through the entire stadium. By the sixth, competitors were visibly avoiding eye contact with him in the hallway. By the eighth, 2 students forfeited before their matches even began, citing scheduling conflicts that fooled absolutely no one. Julian watched the whole spectacle unfold while trying, and mostly failing, not to laugh. The funniest part being that Theo seemed genuinely baffled by everyone's reaction. He apologized after every win. He looked concerned every time someone forfeited. He looked almost hurt whenever the crowd flinched away from him, as if he truly couldn't understand why anyone found a man capable of leveling small buildings even slightly intimidating. It shouldn't have been endearing. Somehow, infuriatingly, it was. Julian rejected the thought immediately. Absolutely not. He was not about to start describing protagonists as endearing. That path led directly into plot territory, and plot territory was dangerous. The one moment that genuinely rattled him came during the semi-final round, when a stray combat spell, deflected off an opponent's shield at an unlucky angle, went careening straight toward the lower stands, directly where Julian happened to be sitting with a stack of forgotten paperwork on his lap. He barely had time to register the streak of light before Theo was simply there. Having crossed the length of the arena faster than Julian's eyes could properly track, one arm thrown up to intercept the spell before it ever reached the barrier separating the stands from the field. The impact rattled the whole section. Sparks scattered across the crowd. Theo lowered his arm, checked that Julian was unharmed with a single sweeping glance, and then turned back toward his stunned opponent as though he hadn't just crossed an entire combat arena in under 2 seconds. "You should be more careful with your aim," he said mildly, and the match resumed as if nothing had happened. Julian sat frozen in his seat for a long moment afterward, forgotten paperwork sliding off his lap entirely. Around him, Damien and Felix exchanged a look that Julian was too rattled to properly interpret. It would be months before he understood exactly what that look had meant. "Did you see how fast that was?" Felix asked, voice unusually quiet for once. "I saw," Damien said. "That's not normal reaction speed. That's not even tournament-level reaction speed." Damien said nothing for a moment, watching Theo settle back into his combat stance across the field as though he hadn't just crossed 30 meters of open arena in under 2 seconds. "No," he agreed finally, "it isn't." Neither of them said anything else about it that day. But Julian noticed, in the weeks that followed, that both of them had started watching Theo with a different kind of attention. Less competitive infatuation, more quiet, searching curiosity, as though they too had started to suspect that the gentle luminous protagonist rooming with Julian Voss was not in fact entirely what he appeared to be. That evening, Julian sat on the dormitory balcony reviewing financial reports while the sunset painted the campus gold. For once, everything felt peaceful. Then the balcony door slid open, and Theo stepped out with 2 cups of coffee. Julian groaned on sight. "How did you even know I was out here?" "You come out here every Wednesday evening," Theo said, handing him a cup. "You've done it for 3 weeks straight." Julian lowered the financial report very slowly. Theo settled beside him, still smiling, still impossibly calm, still, somehow, everywhere. A slightly unsettling thought crossed Julian's mind. What do you even do when I'm not around? Theo considered the question with more seriousness than it deserved. The pause stretched a beat too long. "Wait until you are," he said finally. Julian stared at him. Theo smiled back, unbothered. The evening breeze kept drifting lazily across campus. Somewhere below, students laughed. Birds circled overhead. Everything looked perfectly, deceptively normal. But a strange chill ran down Julian's spine anyway, one he couldn't quite explain and wouldn't be able to for a while yet. Because while Damien and Felix were busy stumbling toward feelings for each other, exactly as the novel intended, Theo Ashworth had already developed an entirely different kind of interest, and it was pointed directly, unmistakably, at Julian. There was, however, one incident from that same stretch of the semester that Julian didn't fully understand until much later. A small thread he'd file away and only unravel in hindsight. A rival delivery service had launched that autumn, backed by a wealthy upperclassman named Corwin Vane, who made no secret of his intention to run Julian's fledgling business into the ground out of pure competitive spite. For 2 weeks, Corwin's operation undercut Julian's prices, poached 2 of his part-time runners, and spread a rumor that Julian's enchanted delivery crates had a habit of losing their contents mid-transit, a claim that was, infuriatingly, both false and effective. Julian stayed up 3 nights straight trying to salvage his reputation, running numbers, drafting a public rebuttal, seriously considering whether he'd need to liquidate part of his savings just to survive the semester. Then, without warning, Corwin's operation simply collapsed. His primary supplier abruptly canceled their contract. Two of his largest early investors quietly withdrew their funding within the same week. The rumor about Julian's crates evaporated from campus gossip almost as fast as it had spread, replaced by an oddly persistent story about how Corwin himself had been caught shorting his own runner's pay. Julian never proved anything. He never even asked. But he noticed, filed it away, and didn't think much more of it. Not until months later, staring at a notebook full of handwriting that documented every small detail of his life with unsettling precision. By then, the pieces fit themselves together without needing to be asked. At the time, though, all Julian registered was relief, a full night's sleep, and a passing, half-formed thought that things around him had an uncanny habit of resolving themselves whenever they threatened to make him unhappy. If Julian Voss was good at one thing, it was recognizing danger early. In his old life, danger had usually come dressed as volatile markets, disastrous investments, and clients who wanted miracles delivered on a shoestring budget. In this life, danger apparently wore a soft smile, had hair the color of moonlight, and had somehow memorized Julian's entire weekly schedule without ever once asking for it. That realization should have concerned him more than it did. Instead, Julian found himself increasingly distracted by the fact that his side businesses were doing shockingly well. 3 months post-transmigration, his campus delivery service had become one of the most used platforms on campus, a small operation of part-time student runners that had ballooned into something genuinely profitable. Students paid handsomely to have meals, textbooks, and enchanted study supplies delivered straight to their dorms. Even a few professors had started using it. Julian had recently opened negotiations with local shops outside the university gates. For the first time in either of his lives, the future looked like it was going exactly where he wanted it to. No romance, no drama, no accidental participation in someone else's love story, just quiet, steady wealth. Fate found that plan personally offensive. The first crack in his careful little world appeared during a meeting with upperclassmen interested in investing in his latest venture. Julian had deliberately booked a private conference room in a quiet corner of the administration building, a room almost nobody used, tucked away and requiring a special reservation, which meant there was no logical reason for Theo Ashworth to be anywhere near it. And yet, when Julian arrived 15 minutes early, Theo was already there, tea in hand, book open, perfectly settled, as if the room belonged to him. Julian stopped dead in the doorway. Theo glanced up and smiled, the shift happening so fast it looked automatic. "You're early," Theo said. "So are you." Theo checked the clock. "I got here an hour ago. Why?" Theo considered the question with total sincerity, as though the answer should have been obvious. "You said the meeting mattered. I wanted to wish you luck before it started. An hour early? Just in case." The answer made no logical sense whatsoever, and yet Theo seemed to mean every word of it. Eventually, Julian gave up trying to make sense of him. That was becoming a common occurrence lately. Understanding Theo Ashworth felt less like understanding a person, and more like trying to reason with a beautiful, slow-moving natural disaster. Then the real trouble started. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of forgettable day that should have passed without incident. Julian had spent the afternoon buried in contracts, negotiating a new partnership with merchants outside campus. By the time he escaped the administration building, his eyes ached and his patience had entirely run out. He wanted exactly one thing: coffee, specifically from a tiny cafe tucked behind the academy's western district, one so obscure that most students had never heard of it. Julian had found it by accident and never told a soul. He was fairly certain anyway. When he pushed open the cafe door, Theo was already sitting inside. Not just sitting, waiting. A cup of Julian's exact coffee order sat untouched across the table, still steaming, as though Theo had somehow calculated the precise minute Julian would walk in. Julian froze in the doorway. Theo looked up, and the smile that broke across his face could have powered a small city. "You're running later than usual," Theo said. Julian stared at the coffee, then at the empty chair, positioned like it had been waiting for him, too. Everything about the scene looked suspiciously prepared. "Theo," Julian said slowly, "how did you know I'd come here?" Theo blinked, genuinely confused by the question. "You always come here after stressful meetings. You sit by the window. You order this exact coffee. You stay about 45 minutes, sometimes 50. Something inside Julian quietly cracked. not because the information was wrong. The problem was that it was completely accurate, down to details Julian himself had never consciously registered. Theo apparently had. Every single one. Actually, the incident that stuck with Julian longest that week wasn't the coffee shop at all. It was something smaller, something he almost didn't register as strange until he was lying in bed that night replaying the day. On his way out of the cafe, Theo had reached over without a word and adjusted the strap of Julian's bag, which had slipped halfway down his shoulder under the weight of too many contracts. It was such a small automatic gesture that Julian hadn't even thanked him for it. Hadn't really processed it at all until hours later, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a person could care about something as insignificant as a bag strap, without it ever once seeming like an inconvenience. It got worse 2 weeks later, when Julian discovered exactly what happened to people who badmouthed him within Theo's earshot. It happened during a networking event for students from influential families. Normally Julian's favorite kind of event, since connections led to opportunities and opportunities led to money. Unfortunately, one bitter classmate decided Julian's recent success was a personal insult and spent a solid 10 minutes loudly announcing that Julian's achievements were nothing but inherited wealth and luck. Julian wasn't even offended. Successful people attracted criticism the way porch lights attracted moths, and he'd heard far worse. What he hadn't noticed was Theo entering the room partway through the tirade, standing quietly near the refreshment table, smiling politely, looking exactly as unbothered as always. 5 minutes later, every investor in the room had rejected the classmate's own pitch. 10 minutes later, 3 professors who'd previously backed him withdrew their support without explanation. 15 minutes later, a recruiter from one of the largest magical corporations on the continent quietly rescinded his internship offer. It was swift, efficient, thorough, and nearly invisible. The classmate left the event looking like a man who'd survived a small natural disaster. Julian watched him go, then turned slowly toward Theo, who was sipping his tea with the serenity of a man who'd spent the last quarter hour doing absolutely nothing wrong. "Theo," Julian said carefully, "did you do something?" Theo blinked, all innocence. "No." Julian narrowed his eyes. Theo's smile stayed exactly where it was, beautiful, angelic, and unmistakably guilty of something. The real breaking point arrived in winter, and it arrived courtesy of Felix Hart bursting into their dorm room without knocking. A habit Julian was fairly sure violated at least one campus ordinance. Julian looked up from his desk just in time to watch Felix collapse dramatically onto the couch. "You need to help me." "No," Julian said immediately. "I haven't even explained. This is important." "No." Felix looked personally wounded. Across the room, Theo silently handed Julian a coffee without being asked, and neither of them acknowledged it, because somewhere along the line that had simply become normal. Felix pointed at Julian aggressively. "See? See that? See what? That. That what? That," Felix repeated, growing visibly more frustrated. Finally, he grabbed Julian's face with both hands. "How are you this oblivious?" "Theo, help me out here. I'm enjoying this too much," Theo said. Julian stared at his roommate. "Traitor?" "Absolute traitor," Felix agreed, releasing Julian's face and pointing dramatically at the ceiling, as if addressing a higher power. "Everyone knows." "Knows what?" Julian asked. Felix looked genuinely horrified by the question. "Everyone knows Theo's in love with you." The room went dead silent. Julian turned slowly toward Theo, who calmly sipped his tea and offered no denial whatsoever. The lack of denial was, itself, deeply concerning. "You mean," Felix pressed on, clearly on a roll now, "he memorizes your entire schedule, tracks your coffee order down to the minute, keeps emergency snacks specifically for when you skip meals, once searched half the campus because you were 30 minutes late coming home, and you thought that was just friendship?" The silence turned physically painful. Julian looked at Theo. Theo smiled and nodded once, as if formally confirming every accusation on the record. Julian felt something like his soul quietly excuse itself from his body. Unfortunately, that wasn't even the most absurd development of the season, because while Theo slowly revealed himself as a terrifyingly devoted menace, Damien and Felix were busy engineering an entirely different kind of disaster. The novel had always claimed they'd fall for each other while competing for the protagonist's attention. Reality, it turned out, was funnier than fiction. Neither of them cared about competing for Theo anymore. They'd moved on to competing with each other instead, and neither had noticed yet. One evening, Julian walked into the student center to find them arguing beside a vending machine. Again. "You never listen," Damien said, arms crossed. "You never communicate," Felix shot back. "I communicate fine. You disappear for 3 days whenever you're upset. I need space. You need therapy." The surrounding students nodded in unison. Felix looked personally betrayed. Damien looked exhausted. Julian looked frankly delighted. The argument kept escalating until Felix suddenly blurted, "Why do you even care?" The room went silent. Damien froze. Felix froze. Several nearby students froze along with them. For one long, suspended second, neither man had an answer. Then they both panicked simultaneously. Felix bolted, actually bolted, out the door and down the hall. Damien took off after him without hesitation. The student center erupted into cheers. Someone started taking bets on the spot. Julian sat down, opened a snack, and enjoyed the show, because for the first time since transmigrating, he finally understood something important. The original novel hadn't vanished. It had simply gone completely off script. And somehow that made everything infinitely more entertaining. After watching Felix nearly have a public breakdown in the student center, with Damien chasing after him like the closing scene of a romance movie, Julian made the mistake of assuming things would settle down. That assumption had absolutely nothing to support it, and he should have known better, because life had apparently decided that if he insisted on being oblivious for months on end, the universe would compensate by throwing every possible clue directly at his face until he finally caught up. The question was no longer whether Theo liked him. Felix had already put that particular rumor to rest loudly with witnesses. What Julian hadn't fully grasped yet was the scale of it. Everyone else, it turned out, had understood that part ages ago, to the point that they'd apparently moved on to discussing wedding venues. Julian discovered this horrifying fact at a faculty banquet celebrating a handful of standout student projects. He'd been invited for his fast-growing businesses. Theo had been invited because he was annoyingly excellent at nearly everything he touched. The hall was packed with students, professors, investors, and assorted influential guests. Julian was mid-conversation with a potential investor when an elderly professor approached, glanced between Julian and Theo, smiled knowingly, nodded to himself, and walked off without a word. Nothing strange there. Except 5 minutes later, another professor did the exact same thing. Then another. Then another. "What is happening?" Julian finally muttered. Theo looked up from his dessert. "What do you mean? Why do the professors keep looking at us like that?" Theo considered the question, then smiled. "I have no idea." The answer was suspicious. Deeply suspicious. Before Julian could investigate further, Professor Whitlow from the economics department approached their table, placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, glanced at Theo, then back at Julian. "Take good care of him," the old man said solemnly. Julian blinked. "Excuse me?" The professor sighed, the way one might sigh at a particularly slow student. "The poor boy looks at you like you're the sun." Silence. Theo quietly drank his tea. Julian turned toward him very slowly. Theo refused on principle to make eye contact. That was, in itself, answer enough. Professor Whitlow wasn't finished either. He lingered a moment longer, studying the two of them with the fond exasperation of a man who'd clearly watched this exact drama unfold in a dozen other students over a long career. "You know," he said, addressing Julian directly now, "I had this one in my seminar back in September. Sat in the very back, never said a word for the first month, until one day a classmate made an offhand joke about your delivery service being overpriced." He nodded toward Theo. "This one stood up in the middle of my lecture, mid-sentence mind you, and calmly explained, for nearly 4 minutes, exactly why the pricing was justified. Cited profit margins, cited operating costs. I had to ask him to sit back down so I could finish my point about supply elasticity." Julian turned to Theo, very slowly. "You did what?" "The joke was inaccurate," Theo said, entirely unbothered. "I felt someone should correct the record. You interrupted a lecture, briefly." Professor Whitlow chuckled and wandered off toward the dessert table, leaving Julian to stare at his roommate with an expression somewhere between horror and reluctant, traitorous fondness. It was, he would later admit, the exact moment the fondness started winning. The true disaster arrived weeks later, after Julian made the tactical error of asking Damien and Felix to rank exactly how bad the situation actually was, arguably the single worst decision he'd made all year. The 4 of them were gathered in a private study room when Julian casually asked, "Okay, but on a scale of 1 to 10, How not normal is Theo's behavior, really? Silence. The specific kind of silence that told him instantly he'd made a mistake. Felix stared. Damien stared. Theo looked politely innocent, which was impossible, because he was clearly guilty of something. Eventually Felix spoke. "You mean the part where he's memorized your entire class schedule?" Julian nodded. Felix looked horrified. "You think that's the weird part?" Julian felt a small, nervous chill. "What do you mean?" Damien pinched the bridge of his nose and spoke slowly, like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a small child. "Julian, Theo once knocked out a fourth-year combat student for making fun of your business." The room went quiet. Julian turned toward Theo. Theo smiled. "It wasn't about you." "Then what was it about?" "He was annoying." That explanation convinced literally no one. Felix jumped back in. "It's not even the worst part. He also went to 18 separate business seminars, despite having zero interest in business." Theo looked thoughtful. "I was interested." "You fell asleep during 6 of them." "I was tired. You brought a blanket." "I planned ahead." Felix pointed dramatically. "You only went because Julian was there." Theo considered arguing, then apparently decided honesty was the faster route. "Yes." The room exploded. Damien buried his face in his hands. Felix laughed so hard he nearly toppled out of his chair. Julian sat frozen while Theo remained completely unbothered. As if attending 18 unrelated lectures for someone else's degree program was perfectly reasonable behavior, and everyone else was simply overreacting, which somehow made it all so much worse. The final blow landed by accident during winter break. Julian came back to their dorm earlier than expected after a long stretch of meetings. The room looked empty, at first. Then he noticed a notebook left open on Theo's desk. He had no intention of reading it, none whatsoever. Unfortunately, the notebook was open, and unfortunately his own name was sitting right there on the page. Curiosity won, a fatal mistake. Julian stepped closer, and then went completely still. His first instinct was to close the notebook and pretend he'd never seen it. His second instinct, considerably less dignified, was to keep reading anyway. The notebook was filled, page after page, with observations, not sinister ones, not alarming ones. Somehow the reality was worse than that. Every single page was devoted to things Theo liked about him. Julian likes strawberry pastries, but only from that one bakery near the West Gate. Julian pretends he hates being praised, but secretly loves it. Julian overworks himself whenever he's stressed. Julian's smile changes when he talks about the future. Julian always checks whether everyone else has eaten before he touches his own plate. Julian looks happiest when he's talking about something he built with his own hands. Page after page continued in the same vein. Small, quiet, unremarkable details. Details Julian himself had half forgotten. Details nobody should have noticed unless they'd been paying attention closely for a very long time. Julian says he doesn't believe in luck, but he knocks on wood anyway. Julian flinches, very slightly, whenever someone mentions starting over. Julian sometimes stares at nothing for a long moment, like he's remembering something from somewhere else, and then shakes it off before anyone can ask. That particular entry made Julian's stomach drop in a way the others hadn't. He read it twice, then a third time, feeling an odd chill settle over him that had nothing to do with the winter air leaking through the window. He thought, briefly, of every time he'd caught Theo watching him a beat too long, after some offhand comment about his old life. Every time Theo had asked a question that skirted a little too close to the truth, and then let it go without pushing. He filed the thought away, uneasy, unresolved, and did not have the courage to ask Theo about it directly. Not that day, not for a long while after, either. Some questions, he decided, were easier left for a version of himself brave enough to hear the answer. The last page nearly finished him off. At the very bottom, in careful handwriting, was a single line. "I think Julian deserves to be loved properly." Nothing else. Just that. For a long moment, Julian couldn't move because all the absurdity of the past few months suddenly resolved into something painfully specific. He'd known, in the abstract, that Theo cared about him. Felix had made sure of that. What he hadn't understood, until this exact moment, was the shape of it. Not a passing crush, not an infatuation that would fade by spring, but something patient and thorough and years in the making, written down page by page, as if the act of noticing was its own kind of devotion. Theo hadn't just fallen for him. He'd been quietly, carefully learning him, for longer than Julian had even been paying attention. Julian confessed 3 days later, mostly because he finally accepted he was completely, hopelessly doomed. There was no surviving the discovery of an entire notebook dedicated to your well-being with your denial intact. The confession itself turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple. No grand speech, no misunderstanding to untangle, just two people sitting together under a snow-dusted pavilion while winter light turned the campus silver and gold. Julian had rehearsed a dozen different openings on the walk over. Something clever, something dignified, something that wouldn't make him sound like a man who'd spent 3 straight nights rereading the same notebook entry until the words stopped making sense. In the end, none of it survived contact with Theo's face. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Julian sighed. I found the notebook. Theo went rigid, completely, catastrophically still. Julian had never seen him look that alarmed, not even during the combat tournament, not even in an actual emergency. Apparently, a notebook represented a genuine existential threat. It was almost funny enough to laugh at, almost. Instead, Julian reached over and laced their fingers together. The effect was immediate. Theo simply stopped functioning, like the Academy's strongest student had crashed like an overloaded engine. Julian found it, against all his better judgment, unbearably endearing. I like you too, you know. The words hung in the cold air. Theo stared at him like the world had briefly paused on its axis. Then something extraordinary happened. Pure, unguarded happiness, spreading across his whole face, the kind that made everything around him look brighter by comparison. For one suspended second, Theo looked like a man who'd just been handed the entire universe. Then he hugged Julian, immediately, without warning, without mercy. Theo, no response. Theo, I need oxygen. Sorry, Theo murmured, not loosening his grip in the slightest. It was much later that same night, wrapped in blankets on the balcony with 2 mugs of cooling tea between them, that Julian finally worked up the nerve to ask about the line in the notebook that had unsettled him so badly. You wrote that I sometimes look like I'm remembering something from somewhere else. What did you mean by that? Theo went quiet for a moment, considering the question with more care than Julian expected. I don't know exactly, he admitted. Just sometimes you'd say something that felt too old for you, too tired. Like you'd already lived through choices you hadn't made yet in this life. I used to wonder if you were carrying something you'd never told anyone. He glanced sideways, almost shy about it. I decided it didn't matter where it came from. Whoever you were before you got here, I liked who you turned out to be. That was enough for me. Julian let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, something in his chest loosening for the first time in months. He didn't tell Theo the truth that night, not the whole of it, not yet, but he decided quietly that someday he might. For now, it was enough that Theo had noticed the strangeness in him and loved him anyway, no explanation required. The years that followed were, relatively speaking, peaceful, at least compared to their first year at the academy. Julian's businesses kept expanding. Theo graduated with honors nobody was surprised by. Damien and Felix finally admitted, after nearly giving their entire friend group stress headaches, that they were in love with each other. Their confession took 6 months, 3 public shouting matches, 1 accidental first date neither of them had realized was a date, and an intervention organized by exhausted classmates. When they finally got together, half the academy celebrated. Several professors openly admitted relief. One reportedly cried. Meanwhile, Theo somehow became both more normal and less normal after entering an actual relationship. The devotion never faded. If anything, it evolved into something even more elaborate. He learned, eventually, to ask before showing up somewhere instead of simply appearing, though he never quite gave up the habit of already knowing the answer before he asked. Fortunately, Julian eventually built up something resembling immunity to it. Mostly, probably, their friends adjusted too in their own ways. Felix and Damien's on-again, off-again bickering matured into something steadier, though the arguments never fully disappeared. They simply got quieter, more affectionate, occasionally ending in laughter instead of one of them fleeing down a hallway. Julian's business empire, meanwhile, expanded well beyond the academy gates. Warehouses, a modest fleet of enchanted transport carriages, a training program for young entrepreneurs that several professors now openly recommended to their own students. He liked to joke that the original novel's most embarrassing side character had somehow ended up funding half the campus. 5 years later, people still occasionally caught Theo watching Julian across a room, like he was witnessing a small miracle. He still remembered every preference, every habit, every tiny, forgettable detail. He still lit up, without fail, the moment Julian walked into a room. The difference was that now Julian smiled back immediately. Somewhere along the way, the attention had stopped feeling like too much and started feeling like home. And that, Julian privately admitted, might have been the funniest part of the whole story. He'd transmigrated into a romance novel absolutely determined to avoid the plot, avoid the protagonist, and avoid love altogether, and instead he'd stumbled straight into the arms of the most devoted, terrifyingly affectionate, mildly unhinged man in the entire book. Looking back, he couldn't bring himself to regret a single second of it. Not everyone got to be loved that thoroughly. Even if the love in question occasionally came with color-coded schedules, an emergency snack inventory, and a boyfriend who somehow always knew exactly where he was. Some habits, apparently, never changed, and Julian wouldn't have traded it for anything. 10 years after Julian Voss transmigrated into a BL novel and immediately swore off romance entirely, he found himself standing on the balcony of a sprawling countryside estate, watching children sprint across a sun-drenched garden, and wondering exactly where everything had gone wrong. Or, more honestly, exactly where everything had gone right. The estate rolled out across green hills beneath a brilliant summer sky, flower beds blooming in every direction, magical windmills turning lazily in the distance, lake water catching the drifting clouds overhead. It was the kind of peace Julian used to dream about during exhausting nights in his old life, back when success always felt one milestone away and happiness always seemed scheduled for some later, more convenient date. Standing here now, years later, he finally understood something important. The best moments of his life had never been the business wins, the awards, the empire he'd built from nothing. The best moments had always been the people, and the person responsible for most of them was currently wrapped around him like an especially affectionate octopus. Theo. No response. Julian sighed. You know we're in public. Theo considered this, then tightened his hold. Yes. That doesn't bother you? No. It should. It doesn't. Julian felt his soul quietly step out for some air. 10 years, and some things never changed. Theo still treated him like the most precious thing in existence. And, not that Julian would say this out loud very often, he'd long since stopped minding. The truly embarrassing part was that he'd become just as bad, eventually. Not quite as dramatic. Nobody could out-dramatic Theo. That was simply not a competition Julian could win. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped pulling away from hugs on reflex, stopped pretending not to enjoy the attention, stopped acting annoyed whenever Theo showed up holding his favorite coffee for no particular reason. Instead, he found himself smiling, unprompted, at the sight of silver hair in a crowded room. Found himself looking for Theo whenever they'd been apart too long. Found himself feeling strangely off balance whenever Theo wasn't nearby. In the end, they'd probably ruined each other equally. The thought made Julian smile. Theo noticed immediately, of course he did. The man could apparently sense a shift in Julian's mood from several kilometers away. You look happy, Theo said. Julian rolled his eyes. You say that every time I smile, because I like seeing it. That's unbearably cheesy. I know, Theo said, perfectly serious, which somehow made it worse. Laughter drifted up from the gardens below. Julian glanced down to find its obvious source. Several children racing through the flower beds while a visibly worn-out Felix Hart attempted and failed to restore order. Slow down. Nobody slowed down. Don't climb that. Someone immediately climbed it. Why are you all like this? One of the kids pointed at him accusingly. Because we're related to you. Felix looked personally attacked. Nearby, Damien sat under a tree with a book, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. A remarkable feat, considering of the children had just attempted to ride a magical garden construct like a horse. Julian genuinely couldn't tell if Damien had unshakable patience or had simply given up years ago. Probably both. It was hard to picture, watching them now, just how ridiculous their whole relationship had been back at the academy. The endless arguing, the stubbornness, the mutual denial that had left their entire friend group, wondering if they'd ever get their act together. The answer, eventually, had been yes. Eventually, after causing no small amount of second-hand stress to everyone around them, their wedding remained legendary on campus, mostly because Felix had cried before the ceremony even started, cried again during the vows, and cried a third time at the reception. Damien never let him live it down. Felix maintained he'd simply been emotionally overwhelmed. Damien maintained he was being dramatic. The debate had never technically been resolved. Their kids had inherited traits from both of them, which the universe probably should have thought twice about. One had Felix's boundless energy paired with Damien's sharp mind. The other had Damien's unreadable calm paired with a talent for quietly starting chaos behind everyone's back. Together, they were a menace. Their parents adored them regardless. A high-pitched squeal cut through Julian's thoughts. A small girl came sprinting toward the house. Silver hair, golden eyes, unfairly adorable. His daughter carried to term through the same old bloodline magic that ran in half the noble houses on the continent, and unfortunately equipped with Theo's stubbornness and Julian's uncanny knack for accidentally causing problems. A dangerous combination by anyone's standards. Julian's gaze drifted, unbidden, to the thin silver band on his own left hand, and then to the matching one on Theo's. He thought back to the night he'd finally proposed, not with some grand gesture, not with an audience, but on this exact balcony, holding a ring he'd designed himself and a speech he'd rewritten a dozen times, and ultimately abandoned entirely in favor of simply saying, "I don't want to imagine any version of my life that doesn't have you memorizing my coffee order in it," Theo had cried, loudly, undignified, ugly, wonderful crying that had startled a flock of birds out of the nearby trees and left him laughing through tears when he finally managed to say yes. Felix had never let either of them forget that Theo, Mr. Unshakable, Mr. Could level a building and apologize for it, had cried harder at his own proposal than Felix had at his entire wedding. Theo maintained the two situations were not comparable. Felix maintained they absolutely were. The debate, predictably, remained unresolved to this day. "Papa," she launched herself at him without slowing down. Julian caught her on reflex. 10 years of practice made that easy. She smelled like sunshine and crushed grass, and faintly, like the goat that had apparently been involved in whatever chaos she'd just escaped. Behind her trailed their son, slightly older, equally dangerous in his own way, though where his sister charged headfirst into trouble, he preferred to study a situation before deliberately creating it. Julian privately suspected the boy would grow up to be either a genius or a criminal mastermind. Possibly both. "Did you two have fun?" Julian asked. Both children started talking over each other at once, producing an explanation involving buried treasure, a runaway goat, a race, and somehow, a pie. Julian understood none of it. Theo, naturally, understood every word. "That sounds like quite an adventure," Theo said. "It was," the kids agreed, cheering. Julian stared at him. "How do you even follow that?" Theo just smiled. "I speak their language." As evening settled over the estate, the whole family gathered for dinner. The long table groaned under food, noise, and laughter. The kids argued about games. The adults traded stories. Somebody started a debate. Somebody else started a second one on top of it. The whole thing was loud and warm and utterly unremarkable, which was exactly what made it so precious. At the far end of the table, their daughter was loudly narrating an entirely fictional account of the day's treasure hunt to anyone who'd listen, embellishing wildly with every retelling. Their son sat beside her, arms crossed, quietly correcting each exaggeration with the weary patience of an older sibling who had clearly given up trying to stop the story from growing. Felix, still nursing wounded pride from the garden, had somehow gotten roped into judging which version of the tale was more believable, and was taking the responsibility with far more gravity than the situation warranted. Damien watched the whole performance over the rim of his glass, saying nothing, the corner of his mouth betraying him completely. Julian found himself looking around the table, at Felix insisting loudly that he wasn't competitive, at Damien immediately wordlessly disproving that claim, at the kids laughing over something ridiculous, at his own family, at Theo seated beside him. For a moment, old memories surfaced. The cramped dorm room, the first awkward mornings, the absurd string of misunderstandings, the slow accumulation of small moments that had somehow, eventually, led all the way here. Somewhere down the table, Felix was now attempting to convince the children that he'd once personally defeated a dragon, a claim that grew more elaborate with every passing minute, and that Damien dismantled, fact by fact, without ever once raising his voice. "There are no dragons on this continent," Damien pointed out. "There were. There weren't. You weren't there. Neither were you." The children, delighted, immediately took sides. Julian watched the whole thing unfold with the specific, contented amusement of a man who had spent a decade convinced this exact kind of chaos was the plot he'd been trying so hard to avoid, and who now couldn't imagine wanting to avoid it at all. Back then, he'd believed he understood exactly how this story worked. Back then, he'd been certain the protagonist and his romance belonged to someone else, some other version of events that had nothing to do with him. Back then, he'd viewed love as an inconvenience to be avoided at all costs. Now, years later, those old assumptions felt almost unreal, because the life he'd actually ended up with was so much better than anything he could have planned for. Theo noticed him staring. Of course he did. The man noticed everything. "What is it?" Theo asked. Julian smiled. "Nothing." Theo raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. Under the table, Julian reached over and laced their fingers together. Theo's whole face lit up on the spot. 10 years in, and it still happened every single time. Julian laughed, then finally answered honestly. "I was just thinking everything turned out pretty well." Theo's expression softened. His fingers tightened gently around Julian's. Of course it did. The answer came simple, confident, certain, the kind of certainty that only ever belonged to someone who'd loved with his whole heart and never once regretted a second of it. Around them, the laughter kept going. The kids kept arguing. The sunset painted the whole world gold. And for what felt like the 1,000th time since arriving in this strange, unplanned second life, Julian found himself grateful that fate had completely ignored every single one of his original plans. Because the story he'd spent so long trying to avoid had ended up giving him everything he never knew he needed: a family, a future, a home, and a silver-haired man who still looked at him, 10 years on, like he was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Not a bad ending for a former jealous roommate who'd once sworn, with total confidence, that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with anyone's love story. Not bad at all. Later that night, long after the children had been put to bed, and the last of the dishes had been cleared away, Julian stood once more on the balcony, Theo's arms looped loosely around him from behind, both of them watching the stars come out over the quiet hills. Neither of them said much. Neither of them needed to. 10 years ago, Julian had woken up in a stranger's body, in a stranger's story, convinced the only sensible plan was to stay as far from the plot as possible. He'd never once imagined that the plot, in the end, would turn out to be him. Not the villain of the story, not comic relief, not a cautionary tale in someone else's chapter, just a man who had, against every original plan he'd ever made, found his way home. If Julian and Theo's story stayed with you even a little, we'd love to know which moment got you the most. Tell us in the comments below. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you first. And thank you, genuinely, for sticking around until the end.